This town has been populated since the French and Indian War. A precursor to the Declaration of Independence was written here, and the lead mines made it crucial during the Revolutionary War and got it invaded during the Civil. After that, it became the capital of Virginia's iron industry. Carbide and zinc were also mined here. Now, somewhere along the line, a traveling preacher came by, and he tried to spread the good word. But the people of the town, they weren't trying to hear it, and he cursed it to be swallowed by the earth. Sinkholes are common in areas with zinc mining, and that's exactly what happened. Welcome to Ivanhoe, Virginia.
I've already done a video about the neighboring town of Austinville, and if you've already seen it, you can skip to about the 13-minute mark because the history is going to be the same until the towns get their different names. Pre-Revolutionary War. Fort Chiswell was built in 1752 during the French and Indian War to protect settlers traveling down the Great Wagon Road. The millstones in the monument are the actual millstones that the mill at the fort used. The fort sat at an important junction where the pioneers could either turn and head south to the Carolinas or continue west towards Tennessee and Kentucky. The Great Road began at the port of Philadelphia and traveled through southwest Virginia. The road never ceased to exist, it just got covered in asphalt, and although it's gone through several names through the years, today we call it Route 11. Interstate 81 also closely follows it. The other trail, going south into the Carolinas, is now called Route 52 and is closely followed by Interstate 77. Route 52 crosses the New River at Jackson Ferry Bridge. The first crossing of the river here was in 1770 when a ferry was operated by British Captain William Herbert. The Jackson that the bridge is named after wouldn't show up here until 1806. Fort Chiswell was built at the beginning of the French and Indian War. England and France were fighting in the Americas, and since France was greatly outnumbered, they paid native tribes to side with them, including the Shawnee. Several years after the fort was built, and a few miles away from it, Colonel Chiswell was exploring the banks of the New River when he ran into a Shawnee hunting party. Not wanting to get his day ruined, he ran and saw a cave, so he jumped in it. As he waited for them to pass, he explored, and he found large deposits of lead. In 1761, Colonel Chiswell set up a mining operation on the south side of the river. He bought a bunch of enslaved Africans and British indentured servants to operate it. Problem was, none of them had any mining experience, and the operation failed miserably. Chiswell sailed back to England and went to Wales, where they have a lot of coal mining. He hired a mine manager and a whole crew of miners. After they got here, the mine production increased, but after some time passed, the Welsh miners became slaves, just like everybody else in the mine. A few years later, in 1766, Colonel Chiswell did some frontier stuff in polite society, and then, while he was in jail awaiting trial, he unalived himself. He had two investors, and one of them got in trouble for financial crimes, and that left William Byrd the sole owner. He was a member of the House of Burgesses, which is the pre-revolutionary government, but he was also a notorious gambler. His contribution to the mines was he imported more slave labor. The Revolutionary War. James McGavick was born in Ireland in 1728. He sailed to Philadelphia in 1755, and then he traveled down the Great Road to the modern-day Fincastle, Virginia. There, he ran an inn for travelers that passed by. He got married and had 10 children. In 1770, he sold his land in Fincastle and bought some by Fort Chiswell and the lead mines. He built a house called Poplar Camp and ran a business catering to pioneers traveling down the 2 trails. Now, this is not his house. His was by Austinsville, but this is the Fort Chiswell Manor, and it was built by his sons in 1840. It's the house on the hill that you see at the junction of Interstate 81 and 77 South. To fund the French and Indian War, in 1765, England passed the Tax Act, which required the colonists to use paper with a tax stamp on it for all legal documents. Along with other things, this was a direct tax on the colonists. Then, in 1767 and 68, the Townshend Acts were passed, which put a sales tax on the colonists, allowed British companies to import goods duty-free, and also blocked the colonists from having their own governing bodies that were independent from the British. 8 years after the stamp tax was passed, the duty-free tax on tea was reassessed in 1773, and that was called the Tea Act. At the time of the Tea Act, 86% of the tea in America was smuggled in by the Dutch, and this was done by the British to get the colonists to buy tea from them. Their plan went horribly wrong when a bunch of colonists in Boston, dressed up as Native Americans, boarded a ship full of British tea and threw it into the harbor. Making matters worse, the British really only had control of the city of Boston, but the countryside around it was controlled by illegal colonial governments. To protest, they began closing government buildings like courthouses, and also began a boycott on imported British goods so they wouldn't get paid in tax. To say tensions were getting high would be an understatement. I had to explain all of that so you would understand the backdrop of what James McGavick is about to do here in Virginia. So that's what's going on in Boston in 1755, and at the same time in Virginia. All of this is Fincastle County, which stretches from the modern-day town of Fincastle, which is by Roanoke, all the way to the Mississippi River. And the county seat of this whole giant county is the lead mines near Fort Chiswell. They don't actually have a name yet, they're just called the lead mines near Fort Chiswell. The same year as the Boston Tea Party, James McGavick joins the county safety committee because he's concerned about the growing hostilities. He would host the meetings at his tavern near the lead mines. At one of those meetings, 15 elected county representatives wrote the Fincastle Resolution. It was in response to all that stuff I just told you about. And basically it said we support the British, but if they don't stop messing with us, we're going to fight them. James McGavick not only hosted the meeting that the Fincastle Resolution was written at, but he also signed it. That was January. Now fast forward a couple months to April, it's springtime, and in Boston, the snow's starting to melt. That means for the British Army, it's the beginning of fighting season. So someone gets the great idea, hey, let's go try to disarm all the militia that controls the countryside outside the city. It didn't work out too well for the British, and after they lost the Battle of Lexington, then they lost the Battle of Concord, and they were sent running back to Boston. No one knew it then, but now that is considered the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Virginia's representative brought up the Fincastle Resolution at the Continental Congress, and 18 months after it was written, on July 4th, 1776, a revised version of it was signed by our founding fathers. We call it the Declaration of Independence. If you had no idea that America was in active conflict for over a year before the Declaration of Independence was signed, hit the like button. Maybe you're asking yourself, how does it work signing this treasonous document when you live right next to a military base? Well, it worked out great for these guys, because the British got the message and they packed up and left. The militia took over Fort Chiswell, and they used it to protect their new lead mines, which they commissioned to make ammunition for the Continental Army. In 1777, Virginia Governor Benjamin Franklin appointed Militia Colonel Charles Lynch to oversee the mine. The lead in 150-pound bars was to be taken to the settlement that would become Lynchburg, 130 miles away, in a horse-drawn cart. Lynchburg is not named after Charles Lynch, but instead his brother John Lynch, who spent the Revolutionary War playing safety for the Denver Broncos. After the lead reached Lynchburg, which then was called Lynch's Ferry, it was put on barges and floated down the James River. To increase production, condemned men were sent from a jail in Williamsburg to be more slave labor. The mixed race group had all been sentenced to death. Not much was written about the white men, but all the black men had committed a crime in the process of escaping. The guards fortified the mine, not just to defend against the British, but now they had a growing fear of a slave revolt. Several years after the Revolution began, in 1780, there was an uprising of British loyalists called Tories. Most of the fighting-age males that supported the Revolution had gone off to fight in it, while most of the British army was imported. That created a power vacuum, where the only fighting-age males left were the Tories. They began to form militias and terrorize the Carolinas. Then they turned north and started to head to Virginia. The Virginia militias began to gather at the lead mines. Then they headed south. They met the Tories in Surry County, North Carolina. The only place to cross the Yadkin River was the shallow ford crossing. As the Tories began to wade through the river, the Virginia militia ambushed them, having target practice with everyone stuck in the water. Several days later, all the Tories were rounded up and they were given a pardon. Colonel Lynch, the mine superintendent, found himself in a similar situation, except instead of issuing a pardon, he helped Charles at his plantation in Alta Vista. The sentences were very light, but the worst offenders were tied to a black walnut tree and given 39 lashes. After the Revolution, the Virginia legislature passed a bill absolving militia leaders who administered justice in the absence of a court system of any guilt. It became known as Lynch's Law. From a revolution to a civil war.
Ivanhoe is in the Cripple Creek Mining District. That's a 300 square mile area in Wythe and neighboring Pulaski and Smith counties. They have large deposits of low quality coal, high quality iron ore, and limestone, which are the three ingredients you need to make iron. And don't get me wrong, they had a bunch of other good stuff like magnesium and copper, but we ain't here to talk about that. We're here to talk about iron. The town isn't just in the Cripple Creek mineral region. It sits about a mile from where Cripple Creek meets the New River. Now, the first furnace in this region was built in 1779 in Poplar Camp. I believe this is the Brown furnace, and it was built in 1870. Those miners worked hard, but they partied harder. The town was full of hotels, saloons, and the friendliest women Wythe County had to offer. I mean, really, what did you think a bunch of post-Revolutionary War miners wanted to spend their money on? Neighboring Austinville began calling it the rough side of the mountain. In this rough and rowdy world, where you could watch the Saturday night fights on a Tuesday afternoon from your living room window, Ivanhoe's most famous resident was born.
The town of Ivanhoe had a lot of churches, but earned a reputation as a tough place. The most famous person born in Ivanhoe is Reverend Sheffy. He was born in 1820 and was the youngest of 5 brothers. He was 2 when his mom died, and after that, he was sent to live with his aunt in Abingdon. He attended college for a few years, but dropped out before graduation.
When he was 18, he attended a revival meeting, and after hearing the good word, he was saved, and he became a Methodist. In 1843, he married Elizabeth, and they had 6 children. For income, he was a school teacher, and he also ran a store. Reverend Sheffy had a very well-earned reputation of being a very kind but very odd man. He was also an animal lover. Sometimes he would see tadpoles stranded in a puddle, and he'd pick them up and put them in his handkerchief and carry them to a creek. He prayed for the bees that made his favorite food, honey, and he prayed for any bug that got squished. Elizabeth died in 1854. In the next year, mainly because they couldn't stop him, Sheffy was begrudgingly granted his preacher's license. He was given a circuit that covered 14 counties. Like many traveling preachers of the day, he believed in the supernatural power of prayer. During the summer droughts, he would pray for rain to save the farmers' crops. He would pray for the evil liquor stills to be destroyed. Sometimes they would catch fire, and sometimes storms would come, knock down trees, and destroy them. There's 25 accounts of him praying for liquor stills that ended up being destroyed. He wanted to become a preacher, but was denied a license because he did not have a college degree. But the heart wants what the heart wants, and he said, degree or not, I am going to become a preacher. In the days before mega churches and millionaire preachers, when Kentucky and Tennessee were the Wild West, Southwest Virginia was sparsely populated, and preachers would travel circuits several counties wide. They would walk weeks through the wilds, holding services at revivals and meeting halls along the way. The legend is a family member got bit by a snake, and while other people tried to give them first aid, or they prayed for their survival, Sheffy dropped down on his knees and he began to pray too. But he prayed and thanked God for the snake because the snake had caused so many more people to pray. He was a little odd. Reverend Sheffy was truly a good-hearted, God-fearing man until he returned to Ivanhoe. There, he preached the good book for a week, but couldn't find a soul to listen to him. The town was taken over by the devil and filled with violence, drunkenness, and loose women. Now, Reverend Sheffy, he knew when he wasn't wanted, so he packed his bags and he left that town never to return. On his way out of town, he cursed it, saying Ivanhoe will never amount to a damn, and I will never return to this town again. He damned it to sink into the earth and be consumed by the fires of hell. That's called the Sheffy curse. And unlike most curses that get proven in time, the longer the Sheffy curse sits around, the longer like it seems it was true. Robert Sheffy is buried in this church's cemetery. This is the Cedar Run furnace, and it was built in 1822. Wythe County was crucial to the South during the Civil War. The lead mines produced 40% of the musket balls they used. But musket balls are useless without a musket, and that's where the iron comes into play. Just like lead, Virginia produced more iron than any other southern state. Alabama was the only one that came close. Unfortunately for the South, Wythe County was only 1 county away from northern lines, and unlike Alabama, it was not protected by geography. Several more furnaces had opened in Wythe County, but during the war, because of labor shortages, all but 4 of them closed.
This is the Speedwell furnace, and it was established in 1799. As the build-up to the Civil War began, Lots of the young fighting-age men who worked at the furnaces enlisted in either the army or the militia, leaving the furnaces short-handed. The way that the furnaces worked is that they would make a product called pig iron, which would just be iron bars, and then those would be sent to a foundry to be turned into products. Lots of the iron was sent to the Traeger Iron Works in Richmond. They produced 1,100 cannons, half of the South's domestic production. They didn't have a lot of iron, but they did cool stuff with it. Traeger made the iron plating for the CSS Virginia, the South's first ironclad ship. In response, the North began making their own ironclad ships, and also came up with a cannon with a rifle barrel to pierce the ironclad's armor. Needing an armor-piercing cannon of their own, the South invented the Brooks rifle, which was also made at Traeger. Besides their own, the Southern Army also had donated European cannons and captured Northern ones. Traeger produced 9 different types of projectiles for them, and that's 90% of the South's domestic production.
The Traeger foundry wasn't the only show in town. Wytheville had its own. It sat where Reed's Mill now is. The Barrett foundry opened not long after the railroad came to town and sat just a half-mile south of the Virginia-Tennessee. It was also on the old road to Ivanhoe. And it was more than just a foundry. It also had a machine shop and a grist mill. In 1861, Barrett's was contracted to make goods for the Southern Army. They made muskets, cannons, and cannonballs. They were also one of the few places in the South that made percussion caps. But almost more importantly for the war effort, they maintained equipment for the lead mines in Austinville and the salt mines in Saltville so they could stay in operation. Barrett's was very innovative, and they even came up with an early idea for a Gatling gun that had 7 barrels. But they were suffering from a lack of skilled workers, or any workers at all. Being so close to northern lines and so strategically important for the South, Wythe County was invaded several times during the Civil War. But most of the time, the regular army and the militia could keep the North from reaching their objectives. In 1864, Northern General George Stoneman left Knoxville, Tennessee with 5,500 men and 4 cannons. They reached Bristol and followed the railroad east, destroying it, burning bridges, and taking out anything else that could be used in the war effort. When they reached Fort Chiswell, they turned south, and on December 17th, they destroyed the lead mines in Austinville and Ivanhoe. Instead of going after the small furnaces up Cripple Creek, the North came to Wytheville, and they destroyed Barrett's foundry.
The post-Civil War boom. In 1880, the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad was bought by an investment firm in Philadelphia. They already owned 3 railroads in West Virginia and Virginia, and they renamed them Norfolk and Western. Eager to play with their new toy, they began building 2 new lines, one north along the New River from Radford into the West Virginia coal fields. They also began building a line south from Pulaski, following the New River, and in 1887 it passed Ivanhoe. The line wouldn't be completed until 1904 and stretched 50 miles all the way to Galax. This is the Little Wythe furnace. It was built around 1860 on the site of an older furnace. The end of the war meant a lot of changes for Wythe County. The lead mining stopped, and Austinville began mining zinc. But the iron industry was about to boom. The demand for iron and the large supply made this the golden era for Virginia's iron industry. From 1889 to 1921, Virginia was consistently one of the top 10 states for iron production. They peaked in 4th place in 1896, 1900, and 1921.
Around 1870, the coke blast furnace was invented. Now, coke is a process that removes the impurities from coal. So this here is a coke furnace, and that's what they would use to operate the blast furnace. Now, the old furnaces, they could only make about 2,000 tons of iron a year. But the new ones, they could make 90,000. In 1880, the Ivanhoe Furnace Company came to town. And as far as I can tell, they're the ones that gave Ivanhoe its name. Now, if you can see this big stone thing right here behind me, that's all that's left of the Ivanhoe furnace.
It might just be a little pile of rocks right now, but this is what the Ivanhoe furnace used to look like. The railroad wasn't done yet, and they began building another line. This one following Cripple Creek, and Ivanhoe was at the junction. That line made Ivanhoe the commercial center for everyone living up Cripple Creek. This is what Ivanhoe's Main Street looked like back then. They had stores and hotels. The good times lasted until the end of iron's golden era, and in 1918, the fire in Ivanhoe's furnace burnt out for the last time. I kinda glossed over it, but I have to talk about Ivanhoe, what the town's named after. He's a character in a book. He's not actually called Ivanhoe, he is from Ivanhoe. He is Scottish nobility who lost his inheritance because he supported King Richard, who was in the Crusades, over his replacement, Prince John. Maybe you've heard of this other story. It's called Robin Hood, and it's got the same plot. King Richard goes to the Crusades, and his brother Prince John wreaks havoc on the countryside, and someone's got to stand up to him. Prince John and King Richard were actually real people, and when King Richard died, Prince John became King John. He wasn't any popular when he became King John, and when he was away fighting the French, the nobility got together and they decided to do that Ivanhoe Robin Hood type thing. When King John came back, the British nobility was waiting on him, and they sat him down and had him sign the Magna Carta, which is the first document that guaranteed civil rights, even if it only applied to the British nobility. But that British nobility probably would have made King John wish the French would have got him if he hadn't signed it. Whether intentional or not, I love the symbolism of a town named after this character that is right next to where the Fincastle Resolution was signed. In this story, we have covered the precursors to the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Alright, look, y'all gonna have to hear me out on this, but if they're both kind of the same story, does that make Maid Marian and Ivanhoe? I'm sorry, I'm just playing, but she is kind of foxy.
I was going to make that joke about my girlfriend's sister, but I'm being mature. This episode of the Neighborhood Backwoods History and Travel channel has been made possible in part by viewers like you. Please follow me on my socials, get yourself a copy of one of my books or a t-shirt. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. We're only 96,000 followers away from 100K.
As the Ivanhoe furnace shut down, National Carbide moved in, and this was their plant in Ivanhoe. It was still a company town, and National Carbide built them a fancy new school. Speaking of school, that's where we're about to go, because I bet you don't even know what carbide is. It's a metallic element, and it's used in everything from the ball in a ballpoint pen to coating on welding rods. But most of Ivanhoe's carbide was used as fuel for lights. By mixing calcium carbide with water, a flammable gas called acetylene is created, and today we use that for cutting torches. The process was first discovered in 1892 and became popular in the early 1900s. It was used to light residential homes, lights on bicycles, and even by miners to light up the darkness. On Christmas Eve, 1932, miners in Illinois hit a pocket of methane gas. The ensuing explosion killed 54 miners and trapped 2 more. The federal inquest into the blast determined that the miners' carbide lights had caused it. When the mine reopened, it had electric lights. The population of Ivanhoe peaked in 1940 with 4,500 people, but as World War II began, Ivanhoe lost its population of young men, and even worse, many of them never returned home from the war. They didn't die in it, they just didn't come back to Ivanhoe. This was the beginning of the end, but Ivanhoe was still prosperous. They even had an opera house.
When work in Ivanhoe would slow down, some of the miners would go up to West Virginia to work in the coal fields. Others would come and work at the mill down in Fries. Or they would come down to Galax and work at Vine Furniture.
No matter what happened though, they were still a tight-knit community. In 1966, National Carbide left town. The post-war bust. To understand what happens next, we're going to have to go back in time. Bertha Springs bought the Austinville mine in 1898. They had been mining zinc in Allisonia in neighboring Pulaski County since 1854. Now, fun fact, they were one of the 4 companies that founded the town of Pulaski.
Now, a few years later, in 1901, the New Jersey Zinc Company comes to town, and they buy Bertha Springs. They also buy another zinc mining operation near Bertha Springs called the Passaic Zinc Company. And the year after they buy Bertha Springs, they buy Austinville.
There, they built a zinc oxide furnace, and that's what this is a picture of. And a few years later, in 1912, they established Palmerton, Pennsylvania, and that's where all the Virginia zinc was sent to get smelted. Now, when we get to our list of cursed towns, Palmerton, Pennsylvania, that's going to be on it. In case you're wondering, zinc is a metallic element, and is often found around lead. As we moved away from iron and started using steel, zinc is used to make galvanized steel, which is resistant to corrosion. The Navy used galvanized steel to make its ships, and both the world wars were a boom for the zinc industry. In fact, America led the world in zinc production until 1971. And that's why, in 1953, the New Jersey Zinc Company began digging 3 more shafts. 2 were in Austinville, and 1 was in Ivanhoe. They dug this shaft 1,100 feet deep, and it had branching mines coming off at different elevations. A tunnel was dug, connecting the Ivanhoe mine to the Austinville mine, and it went 2.5 miles underneath the New River. A 10-ton diesel locomotive carried the ore from Ivanhoe to Austinville. At that time, the mine employed 650 people. These were the hoists that were built at the mine shafts. This hoist still stands above the town of Ivanhoe. Many of the houses were empty, so the residents were consolidated into one area and the rest of the houses torn down to make room for the mine. The snaking mines dug off of the big mine shaft caused sinkholes, swallowing buildings, just like the Sheffy curse said. As I drive through here and you see these open spaces of land, just remember there was a building there, and either it burnt down or there was a sinkhole. Zinc production produces a byproduct that's full of a bunch of nasty carcinogenic stuff, and we're going to get to that here in a minute. But this is a picture of Austinville's pile of byproduct. It says buy bonds or wear them. It's an advertisement for Liberty bonds during the war, but the letters are 28 feet tall. That's a big pile of byproduct. As sinkholes opened up, the company would just come along with byproduct and fill them back in. It's all good until it's all bad, and in 1981, the mine closed for good. Austinville had been in operation for over 200 years. Both National Carbide and New Jersey Zinc were good-paying union jobs, and with them gone, a good job was hard to find. People were making an average of a 63-mile commute to work. National Carbide had donated 200 acres of land to the county for an industrial park, but by 1986, no tenants had been found, and the county considered selling the land. The town's residents got together and they formed the Ivanhoe Civic League, and I believe this old church is where they used to meet. They lobbied the county commissioners to postpone the sale of the land so they could shop around and try to find a new industry, but unfortunately they couldn't find one. Another group of Ivanhoe residents took a bus to Richmond and they asked the state for help. They began to get publicity, and in 1987, a group of college students from Marquette University spent their spring break in Ivanhoe, helping clean up and fix up projects. As the private employers left, they were replaced by government employees, specifically the EPA. The old Carbide plant was leaking contaminants into the groundwater, and it had to be tore down and cleaned up. In the 1980s, there was changes to environmental regulations, and that essentially shut down America's zinc industry and made every zinc mine an EPA cleanup site. The New Jersey Zinc Company, they left four. The byproduct from producing zinc contains arsenic, cadmium, carbon, lead, fluorine, mercury, sulfur, and zinc. And that is the exact same stuff that they used to fill in the sinkholes in Ivanhoe. By the time the EPA showed up, it had been contaminating the groundwater for years. They were also downstream from Austinville, so all of that byproduct that got into the river went to them next. And while that's bad, here's a few more towns that I believe were cursed by the zinc industry way more than Ivanhoe was. There's Pitcher, Oklahoma. The town was 100 years old and was based around the lead and zinc industry. For decades, they piled byproduct up around town until it was surrounded by mountains of white gravelly substance. No one knew the danger of the byproduct, and for decades it blew away with the wind and washed away with the rain. There was a place that the water flowed from an old mine shaft, creating a pond in the mountains of byproduct. It was called the beach by the locals, and on sunny days, families would go swimming there. But it didn't matter how much sunscreen you slapped the kids with. When they got done swimming, they would always get sunburned. And that's because the water from the mine shaft mixing with the byproduct was creating sulfuric acid. That was just one of dozens of ways that the residents of Pitcher began getting poisoned. The town was declared an EPA Superfund site in 1983. In 1994, testing was done of the students at the local school, and it was found that 34% of them were suffering from lead poisoning. The mine also created sinkholes, and buildings began to randomly fall into the earth. Eventually, the state and the EPA declared the land unsafe for human habitation and enacted a mandatory evacuation. If you've ever heard the phrase history rhymes, that's it right there. Palmerton, Pennsylvania, where all the Wythe County zinc was being sent, also became an EPA Superfund site. Its pile of byproduct was called the Cinder Bank. It was 33 million tons, 100 foot tall, 2.5 miles long, and depending, 500 to 1,000 feet wide. Just like Pitcher, the cinder pile would blow away with the wind and wash away with the rain. The byproduct killed 2,000 acres of vegetation, and everything from frogs to children were tested and showed elevated lead levels. Fortunately for Palmerton, instead of being forced out like Pitcher, the EPA case is being closed. Austinville wasn't spared either, and this school had to be shut down when sinkholes opened up underneath it. Both the Wythe County cases are closed, but when the mine closed, the pumps were shut off that kept the river water out of the tunnel, and it filled up with water. The EPA says that it's so contaminated that it should be cleaned up, but if they did, it would just refill with water again, so they're going to leave it like it is. Ivanhoe's still a lot less cursed than Pritchard is, though.
I know what you're thinking. You're saying if that Fort Chiswell place is on the junction of two major interstates, shouldn't they build like a shopping center or something there? You would be right. Welcome to the Fort Chiswell Outlet Mall.
It was built behind the mansion and opened in 1989. It was easy to see from the highway, but hard to find, and it didn't have its own exit built in. Cashiers at the gas stations nearby would report that travelers would often come by and ask them for directions on how to get to it. The outlet mall was never fully occupied because of the slow business. Even in these old pictures, while the place looked so cheery and dressed up for the holidays, this is before Amazon, and the place should have been packed. But that was for highway people and suits on Wall Street making investments. For this part of Wythe County, this was a big deal. Locally, it was a large employer, and everyone either worked there or their family did. The van in the picture is the country cruiser from FM 94 out of Marion. In 2012, the last store closed. It sat sad and lonely, while time and the elements faded the paint. Sadly, in 2018, the outlet mall died a natural death for an old building. It burnt down while teenagers were inside playing with matches.
Alright y'all, that's my video. I hope you liked it. If you did like it, you need to hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. Don't be watching my stuff for free. If you like this one, here's some more you might like.